Hello, this is Sheila Bender with In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today our guest is Ken Doctor. Ken has over 35 years of experience across a wide range of media. He's become a go-to speaker for talking about emerging newsnomics. He writes regularly on the business of media change for Harvard's Nyman Journalism Lab and for Politico Media. He also contributes to CNN Money. He is at work on his second book, following Newsnomics, 12 News Trends That Will Shape the News You Get. It has been translated into Mandarin Chinese, Korean, Portuguese, and Russian, and you can find more about his work on his website, newsnomics.com. He focuses on the many issues and opportunities offered by the transformation of news and consumer media as they move from print and broadcast to digital. Increasingly, he focuses on relationship newsnomics, how news companies must deepen and widen customer relationships with both readers and merchants to compete in a Google, Facebook-dominated ad world. Today, Ken also serves on the Dean's Advisory Council for the University of Oregon School of Journalism in Eugene. Welcome, Ken.
Good to be here.
I'm glad we'll be able to talk about newsnomics, and that's my first question. Is this a word that you coined?
It's true. 2010, Newsnomics came out, and I had left my long career with Knight Ridder Newspapers, 21 years. It was the second largest newspaper company in the country, and went out on my own, and I was covering the business of news. And I was trying to figure out how to describe that in a few words, and I came up with newsnomics. And if you remember, that was a time where a few years earlier, Freakonomics had come out, and then we have seen in the years since so many omics kinds of books. At that point, it just seemed to me the perfect word to describe what is the business challenge of news media, and it has really worked to focus my work and to explain it very easily to everybody else.
What do you think the greatest business challenge is to news media?
Well, clearly advertising has just fallen into a death spiral. If you look at it, for the American daily newspaper industry, just the dailies, they're down about $27 billion a year, every year now. 90% of that is the loss of print advertising.
Because
so
advertising is going digital?
Well, it's going digital. It's changing in a lot of ways, mainly going digital. Yeah, digital has passed newspapers. Half of all the digital advertising money goes to Google, and then Google and Facebook are just growing even more rapidly year after year. And newspapers simply have failed to make that transition. We all use newspaper content online and on our phones, but they make very little money relative to print on their digital products.
So what are they going to do?
They're cutting. We've seen about half the number of journalists we had in 1990 working at daily newspapers. About half of those are gone now. They'll hit the halfway mark probably beginning of 2017 at this point. So we've seen tremendous ownership change. We've seen 14 bankruptcies in the newspaper industry. And most of these companies, 95% of them, are still profitable, but they only maintain their profit by continued cutting. So layoffs, buyouts, and they just go on and on and on.
So your career was built on print journalism, right?
Most of my career was built in print, yeah.
So it's very interesting that you're applying yourself to thinking about news in the digital world. Do you think that there are things we're losing as consumers of the news because of this shift?
A huge loss. The problem is that it's not really measurable. Anyone who has been a newspaper reader who then compares what you get today, and it's easier to compare in print because it's a physical product and you can see what in fact you're getting. If you compare that physical product to what it used to be, you can see that there's a lot less of the product. I liken this to what newspapers companies have done to taking a 2-liter bottle of Coke, reducing it to a 1-liter size, but doubling the price.
Right.
And that's essentially what newspaper companies have done. So it's been a further death spiral. It's hard to quantify how much less we know about our communities, and that's the key here, because local newspapers are key to community knowledge, dailies and weeklies. And as they have cut back, we know a lot less about our communities. That is the really worrying part of this. I was at a newspaper conference and talked about it, and it is hard to quantify, but it's clearly true.
So what is your advice generally for the news industry?
Well, there's all kinds of advice, but it basically to maximize the value of the relationship with readers. And so it's not mainly about the print output or the digital output. It's about the content. It's about the content that is created. And so maintaining a stronger newsroom with a good mix of experienced people and younger people and digital skills and traditional journalism skills, but one big enough and robust enough to adequately cover whatever community they're covering, that's the fundamental that I talk to companies about and the industry about. Then there's a lot of different things and how really to take advantage of this digital environment, which is a wonderful environment. If you like news, our ability to get to almost anything that we can get to, the whole world is available to us in ways that were limited by physical distribution 20 years ago. So how to take advantage of that, how to use Facebook and how to use Twitter, how to use the smartphone for distribution, how to sell and create advertising differently, all those kinds of things, but basically take advantage of the new environment while keeping your core mission really strong.
So they have to raise revenues digitally in order to have the stronger, more robust newsroom?
Well, that's part of what they need to do. They need to maintain 70-80% of their money still come from the print business. So they have to figure out what to maintain out of the print business. And for many of them, the Sunday newspaper in the U.S., Saturday in Europe, but Sunday here is what they need to really focus on because people are going at every age group, but especially the younger ones up, to daily digital. So a real focus on the weekend paper and then a full embrace of digital in all the ways that it can be useful.
I see. Sounds like a very big challenge for an old
industry.
It is.
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah. So I'm curious. I have made the leap to reading the news digitally. It took me years to really feel satisfied with it. I don't look at a lot of advertising. I read a number of different sources for the same story. I get distracted by, this is Google News in particular, I get distracted by the other things I might be interested in. It sort of resembles, but doesn't exactly, how if you're thumbing through a print newspaper, you might see something that makes you stop and read it when you were in the middle of reading something else. Because online it seems endless. You can just pull up another screen and then there's a list of 10 more things you might be interested in. And by the end of it, you sort of forget what it was you started with sometimes. And the image of watching parents enjoy the daily newspaper, hearing it crinkle, all those things seem to be vanishing. And yet printing on paper and distributing it isn't really sustainable. So I'm wondering if you've looked into how getting the news digitally has changed us as consumers in terms of what we think news is.
It undoubtedly has. I have seen and read many studies, and as we know, your experience is typical and it's similar to mine, and to many people, we're all kind of in transition. So it is a moving target of who we are and who we are as newsreaders, who we are as citizens, I think. And one mistake I think I've seen made as we try to understand this is to say it's over and that this is a change that has happened. I think we're not even close to midstream in this change of how humans take in information. I think it's as basic as that. And if you go back to, talk about, you mentioned Google News, you could talk about Google News and you say 1998, Google starts up there and Google News comes out and all of a sudden everybody's using it and using Google search. There was a prevailing opinion, I'd say 10 years ago, even 7, 8 years ago, of, oh my God, nobody's reading longer stories anymore. All they want to read is snippets. Google snippetizes the world, and that's all anybody is going to read. And especially older people would say, oh my God, that's all that younger people are going to read. That was a very strong philosophy. It was also a philosophy, if you remember at that time, go back to like 2005, 2007. Nobody will ever pay for news. Everybody expects the world to be free, especially those young people again. Nobody will ever pay for news. Well, in the years since, look what's happened in terms of the New York Times now has 1 million paying digital-only subscribers. The tablet came along in 2010 and changed once again people's sense of how you could read news, became a long-form print reading or print-like reading time that people spend with it. And we have lots of surveys that show that people like to read longer stories. They like to read original stories. They like to read enterprise and investigative stories. At the same time, people, just like they always watch Entertainment Tonight or read the National Enquirer, they like the salacious stories and the gossipy stories. And if you look at something like BuzzFeed, which is an interesting phenomenon, it is the typical high-low publication. Sometimes it's stupid cat videos, and other times it's investigative reports on human trafficking. This is an old practice in journalism. So I think there is a lot of change. Clearly, we have the ability to get to anything, and we use that much more than just thinking we can only get the daily paper locally or watch the local TV news. We're going to continue to see massive change in terms of how we use stuff, how we decide to use stuff. I think habits are up in the air. And today, in 2015, the main big question is how much the smartphone is going to change our habits as we go forward. That's the big question in front of us today.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 Port Townsend. In case you've just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Sheila is talking with Ken Doctor, a former newspaper publisher and now a consultant to national media on going digital.
Can you talk more about that? You mean because more people will read news on their phones more often during the day?
55% of all news reading in the U.S. now is done on mobile devices. So that would be smartphones and tablets. Probably 20% of that total, of that 55%, 20% of that is tablets. And tablets are a great instrument. Their sales have really slowed down. People do use them a lot, and they spend a lot of time with them. But it is really a smartphone that's become like a personal communication device like we saw on Star Trek 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, perhaps. It is our overall device to access the world. We offload our memories to this device. We get the news there. We get our directions when we're traveling, check the weather, et cetera, et cetera. So already, for your local daily newspaper or the New York Times, more than half of the people coming to that site are coming not from a desktop computer anymore. They're coming from a smartphone, most likely, and a smaller number coming from a tablet.
So because it's smaller, it's going to be presented differently by the digital news sources?
Well, it is today. If you look and see how news is presented, of course, on a much smaller screen, there's decisions to be made about what do you show, in what order, with what kind of hierarchy. We all grew up with page one of a newspaper and other sections, and all those signals that editors give you of what's most important by where something is on a page, how big the headline is, does it have a big photo, does it not, all of those things. It's been very difficult to make that transition to digital media, even on a desktop computer, which is bigger, of how do you communicate those kind of things. And I think that most newspaper sites have failed to really come up with a metaphor that has the kind of intelligence infused in it that a newspaper format had. Of course, the newspaper had 3 or 4 centuries to develop that format. Now, while there's some attention to the desktop and the computer reading on that kind of monitor, the big question is, how do you use that little screen and how do you use it effectively?
I'll be watching for that now. So I hadn't thought about that at all, but what you call the intelligence behind the format of a print newspaper is really intriguing to me.
We just assumed it, right?
Right.
We assumed it would last forever.
Right.
And If you look at the New York Times today, for instance, the New York Times app on the smartphone, it's had major changes just in the last year. And it used to be, it's interesting that it used to be until about a year ago, as most newspaper company sites are on the phone, an automated feed, meaning that the company produced the newsroom produced the stories, but then they would be grabbed and presented on our smartphones, on our Androids and our iPhones. They'd be grabbed by a machine and put in boom, 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 last in, first out. Well, that doesn't give you any sense of hierarchy. Over the last year, the New York Times, which I think is the leader, the New York Times, the Guardian internationally, those two are leaders in presentation. You can see how they're using different headline fonts. They are using images and graphics right on that small smartphone page. They're putting controversial op-ed pieces right in there next to news pieces, so that you've got kind of the full flavor of what the New York Times offers, as opposed to an automated feed that is relatively boring and doesn't give you a sense of all that a newspaper has to offer.
That's really interesting to me. Another thing that I'm finding as a digital reader is, and maybe it's partly relational, say, Facebook, you have a few hundred friends or more, and they post a link to a news article that they found interesting in a paper that you maybe don't read or hadn't read yet. And suddenly I'm reading news that I might not have picked up because of where I live, or because of being busy, or because of using Facebook too much. And suddenly I'm reading an article that's really of interest to me, and I can quickly share with a lot of people. That seems to me to be a really good feature of how the news gets around, more peer-to-peer, kind of, we're interested in this story, let's let it be known to more people. And I'm wondering how that works in with Newsnomics.
You're right, and that phenomenon is an incredible phenomenon. I talked about that when I wrote the book, and I did that book in 10 chapters of 10 major trends going on. And I said about that at that point that we're becoming each other's editors, and that has happened. That was just beginning to happen then, and now it's happening profoundly in exactly the way you described. It used to be beauty and intelligence of page one was great, and I was able to participate in that process and lead that process, but it was limited. And so it's still out there. Print newspapers are still out there. You have the mobile sites, but it's exactly what you're saying of the sharing of content that is rapidly changing what people read. It varies a great deal of how much, for instance, like the New York Times, about 10% of the people coming to the New York Times for articles, 10% of their traffic, will now come from Facebook and Twitter. So that kind of sharing you're talking about. But for BuzzFeed or Vox Media or Vice, these newer companies, 60, 70, 80% of their traffic will come because they've learned how to put their stuff out on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Reddit and others so that it is intended as it is written, as it is headlined, to be very, very shareable. So I think it's another one of these things that, as you point out, we're able to find out stuff that we didn't know we were interested in, and we're really using what has been called the wisdom of the crowds. We're using each other, and if we're using our Facebook friends or our Twitter follows and followers, we are then saying, they probably have a similar take on the world that we do, and I'm interested in what they think. There's an app I just started using called Nuzzle, N-U-Z-Z-L-E. And Nuzzle does this in even a kind of next step way, where it will say, here is the hottest news out there as followed by your friends on Twitter and Facebook, and arranges that in a hierarchy. So if a story is most followed by 12 friends, and that's the most at that point, that's going to be at the top, and then you'd have by 11, and then 9 and 7. It's both a wonderful thing, and at the same thing, I think it feels ungainly. Try to figure out, because it is infinite, like you said at the beginning, it's infinite. You can read news till you drop, or news and news in quotes.
But I have
any kind of content.
I have another response to what you're saying. If an app like that is filtering, and Facebook, the way most people use it, is filtering articles by your friends, telling you, and that whole idea of what's trending, we are missing out on something that I think makes a robust newsroom, which is opinion of dissenting people. That, something's being decided for us based on our friends that doesn't allow us to see another point of view if we don't really search for it.
That's true.
So that seems a little limiting in terms of the value of receiving news. I remember reading something, and I think it was put out by Facebook, that said, if you're only getting one side of the story, you don't have enough friends. And I thought, that's an interesting thing, because Facebook wants us to have lots of friends, of course.
All right, exactly. Yeah, it's very self-serving.
Right, but that's not the thing that we're doing, really, as communities of people. We're getting insular in our opinions.
I don't actually think that's true.
Oh, good.
I think that's a worry. I mean, there's a lot of worries here, especially among people who have seen a lot of the change. And so one of the things people have said, well, serendipity is lost, because the same thing is, remember people who said, well, in a daily newspaper, I love it, you can turn the page and you don't know what's going to be there, and you're going to find stories that you didn't go and search for, right? But that world has been replaced by the world that you talked about, where you run into new stuff all the time because it's touted to you by your friends. So the serendipity of the old newspaper has been replaced. On this part of it, of the question of finding opposing viewpoints, I think in truth, most newspapers didn't give you that much. I mean, you would have an op-ed page that would have 4 pieces on it. And if it was a kind of liberal-leaning newspaper, they'd probably have 1 conservative voice, and vice versa if it was a conservative newspaper. There's 3 or 4. It is true you are going to see more things with more, I think, your own point of view because of the nature of this filtering. But we're lucky. We're a free people in the United States, and we can add anything we want to it. Say, okay, let's add the feeds from my opposing viewpoint. If I wanted to add red state and conservative websites, I can do that really easily and get those into my feed. It might take one step, but the diversity of what I can get, I think, is wider, and I don't think that the old world we came out of was all that diverse.
Thank you. And I know the other thing we can do is we can get foreign newspapers very easily and see points of view that aren't being filtered by our news media, because they're available digitally, and we don't have to make special trips to the library or wonder about how we can hear from that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just think of that. We now accept it, and we now expect that, right? But it was funny when The Guardian, which is a huge news organization now, but it's a tiny. Look at The Guardian. The Guardian has about, I think, 110,000 print readers on a daily basis in Britain. That's it, 110,000. But it reaches 70, 80 million unique visitors worldwide on the Internet. It is just astounding the difference that has made for one news company that takes advantage of it.
So what can we, if anything, as consumers do to help our communities build strong newsrooms?
The options for readers individually have been really limited, and that's one of the issues that I'm working on. If you are lucky, you've got a usually newspaper company, although we can talk about public media and public radio media as well, but usually a newspaper company, if it's a good paper, if they do their job and report pretty widely and fairly of what's going on, the main obvious thing to do is to support it. And supporting it means if there's a print subscription or a print plus digital subscription, paying for it. That's really the best thing you could do. Paying the journalists to keep up their work, even as advertising declines. We don't have a choice in a lot of communities. Where I live, the newspaper is owned by essentially a private equity company. It's been cut back and cut back and cut back. And I have written about and spoken about the need for these companies to essentially get the hell out of the business, that it's not a good business for them, and they're ruining it, and the need for, at this point, the best hope, and the hope we see in big cities like Boston, Minneapolis, Washington, Dallas, even Seattle to some extent with the Blethen family ownership, is private ownership by moneyed people who believe in the role of the press, and even in this difficult financial time are willing to invest in it and steady the ship. For individuals, unfortunately, it is a matter of geography, but if you have the opportunity to support good journalism, to do it. And I mentioned public media. There are about 12 bigger city public radio stations that are trying to turn themselves into public media, meaning that they are investing more in news creation and news production. KPCC in LA is the leader in that. They've got 100 people in a newsroom for a public radio station reporting what's going on in and around LA. And I hope to see that kind of phenomenon grow across the U.S. and into smaller cities as well.
Thank you. Well, I can add that here in Port Townsend, we do have a local newspaper that's both print and digital and well supported and really keeps the community bound together. And we have...
You're lucky.
Yes, and we have KPTZ, which is our radio station.
Yeah.
Where we're talking today, that has definitely created a strong news content about the community. Thank you so much for this talk and for updating us. And before we close, I'd love to repeat the name of your website, which is Newsnomics.com. And could you give us the names of your two books?
Well, Newsnomics is the first book. I'm working on a second one, named for now Relationship Newsnomics, based on a lot of the ideas that I've talked about today.
Thank you so much. And I imagine that the first book, which is out, is also available digitally?
It is, of course.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ken.
Okay, thank you.
You have been listening to In Conversation, Discussions on Writing and the Writing Life with Sheila Bender. For more of Sheila's interviews, please go to Sheila's website, www.writingitreal.com/audio.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Announcer is Kurt Vanderslice.